Well, hello there, children. My name is Preston, and I want to say hello to you. I'm looking forward to spending a few minutes with you and sharing with you my book. It's called Your Bridge to History. And I'm going to read that book with you and maybe have some fun with you today, but I'm looking forward to it. Now, the Bridge to History book is told to you by this young man, and his name is Caleb. And Caleb is going to really be the person that's whose voice I'm using to tell you about and take you through this book. This gentleman, this young man, he's a 14-year-old who went on a historical tour that he's going to share with you. The name of the book is Your Bridge to History. My sister Portia and I are the authors of this book. And so let's get into it. And I remind you that Caleb is your host for this reading. And I'm going to read what he has to say. He has to say, "Hi, my name is Caleb. I am 15 years old and I am a high school student in Omaha, Nebraska. Last year, I was nominated by my youth group to attend a tour that was put on by a man named Preston Love Jr. That's me. Mr. Love founded an organization called Black Folks Matter Institute. In thinking about black youth and black children and children of color and all children as future leaders, Mr. Love recognized that the youth did not know enough about their own history and therefore themselves. He developed a tour as a fun and exciting opportunity, but also an intensive learning experience, and that it is. Mr. Love's mission statement for the tour, and listen, it is learn it, respect it, and go out and make it. History. Learn it, respect it, and make it. Mr. Love planned to take 40 years. I'm sorry. It took me 40 years to learn how to read. I'm just not learning. But Mr. Love, myself, every year I take 40 students from Omaha down south and bring them face to face with their past. His goal was to teach them where they came from, where they've been, and to help them develop where they're going. Then to bridge these three together. His dream, my dream, is to help youth, black, Hispanic, Asian, white, all youth, but in particular my own race, African Americans, into future leaders who know and respect their history. I have become a leader thanks to the tour. And I is still Caleb. Remember, this is Caleb who is walking us through, and he says he's a leader based on this tour. And now he's going to lead you across the bridge to history. After you read this book, you will become a tour alumni just like me, Caleb. And there is Caleb, and he's there with his brother, his two brothers, and I want you to notice the clock right there, that clock. And that clock says, if you can see it, it says it's 4 o'clock when he started telling his brothers about the tour. We'll have to see what time it is when he gets through. There's so much of our history that we have not been taught. Let me share what I learned. That's Caleb talking. What I learned on our tour. We turn the page. First of all, We left in a big tour bus and headed south. As you can see, we left in this large tour bus, and the bus holds 54 people, and we didn't have an extra seat. It was filled up with myself, Caleb, that is, and so many other youth of all shades, color, and ethnicities. Our first stop was Memphis, Tennessee. The Lorraine Hotel is important to our history because Dr. Martin Luther King, a great and courageous leader of the civil rights movement, was killed there. Civil rights means that every person should have an equal treatment under the law. Dr. King was killed because he was the enemy of racism and discrimination, and he had begun to focus on economic rights for all people. He wanted everyone to have equal rights. Some people did not agree with him and took their hatred out on him and others. We also visited the Mason Temple, the international home of the Church of God in Christ, and in the sanctuary is where Dr. Martin Luther King gave his final speech. I have been to the mountaintop, and as you can see, we stood outside his room at the Lorraine Hotel and looked into the room where he spent his last night before he was killed. That was our first stop, Memphis, Tennessee. Not so long ago, in the South, black people had to drink out of separate water fountains. There was a nice, clean fountain for white people and a dirty, rusty one for black people. Here's a picture of what they look like. And you see, one is listed as white only, and the other says for color. And fountains were labeled white and colored, and unfortunately, the colored fountain was dirty and rusty. That's the way it was long ago in the South. Next, Caleb says that we went to Birmingham, Alabama, where we entered the 16th Street Baptist Church. I couldn't believe such a horrible thing that happened there. Let me tell you what happened. In 1963, this church was bombed, and several young girls, and here's a picture of those 4 girls on the page. Those 4 little girls were killed because of that bombing. They were there with their parents, who often visited the church to have civil rights meetings, but on this particular day, they were in church about to go to Sunday school. And so the church was known to be a place where people who were standing up for civil and voting rights and discrimination met. And that's why hatred stood up, and they bombed those churches and killed those little girls. Those of you from Omaha, Nebraska, let me say this. One of those little girls' last name was McNair, Denise McNair, and her grandfather was a pastor here in Omaha, and there are still many of the McNair family that lives here today. So we had a connection to that horrible event. By the way, I want to say that while we were in Birmingham, Caleb says, we learned about voting rights. Here's how they explained it to us. And there's a picture here. And if we were together in person, I would have a jar full of jelly beans for you to look at. And then I wanted you to look at those and then tell me what your favorite jelly bean color is. Now, I like the red ones. And what do you like? Tell your neighbor which one do they like. Or tell your mom, which one do you like? Well, some of you like yellow, some of you like purple. And so when you make that choice about what jelly bean you like, you know what you're doing? You're voting. You're voting for your favorite jelly bean. And that's what voting is. Everybody should have the right to choose their own jelly bean and choose and vote and choose their own candidates. And so that's what voting rights is. And so don't you agree with me that there should not be any discrimination as it relates to our right to choose, our right to vote? And in 1965, there was a law that was passed called the Voting Rights Act, which made it illegal to discriminate between different kinds of people, people of color. Everybody should have the right to vote, and that was voted into law in 1965. On the next day, we went to Selma, Alabama. We visited the voting rights museums and institutes, and we crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge. The Edmund Pettus Bridge. Until 1960, black people were not allowed to vote, as we said, but before the Voting Rights Act was signed. There was a voting rights march from Selma, Alabama to Montgomery, Alabama. And the goal of that march was to get black people registered to vote, and yet it was not practiced. It was discriminated against in those days. That march was to bring attention to it. That first march was called Bloody Sunday because law enforcement beat non-violent protesters as they tried to cross that bridge to go register. There were two more marches. The marches, however, were victorious with the passing of the 1965 act that I mentioned to you earlier. The Edmund Pettus Bridge is unique. It is the only landmark that has gone from honoring white supremacy to becoming a great monument to racial equality. It has become a bridge to our history. The Edmund Pettus Bridge, as you can see. There's a picture of it, and it also is on the cover. The Edmund Pettus Bridge. And so the next day, we went to Montgomery, Alabama, where Rosa Parks, and some of you know that name, Rosa Parks was honored. There she is. There she is on the bus. Notice that she's sitting on the front of the bus. That's Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on the bus to a white person and was arrested and taken to jail. Her arrest set off a protest, and it helped to propel the civil rights movement. This was in the mid-50s. Dr. Martin Luther King helped to set up a boycott. Black people were asked not to ride the bus, and they didn't. The protest lasted for a long time with great personal sacrifice to the community. The boycott, however, was successful. As a result, the bus company almost went out of business, but they no longer practiced, and they then began to allow black people to work for the bus company and also to ride anywhere they wanted to sit anywhere. Thank you, Rosa Parks, and thank you for learning that lesson. While we were in Montgomery, we visited the Equal Justice Initiative, which documents the black children, women, and particular men who lost their lives via lynchings. We learned something important about our history, but we cried there. We'll talk to you later about lynchings, but it's very sad part of your history, and it's worth crying about. Slavery and lynching we'll teach you about someday. After that emotional day in Montgomery, we had a wonderful Black Folks Matter tour barbecue that night. It brought us all closer together, and it was fun. Someone said they only got one chicken wing. Oops. We laughed, and I laughed so hard because I had more than one, because I had a plate full of wings. And so they must have been too late when they got there, because we ate all the wings because the wings were good. Caleb ate all the wings. Every day on the tour, we wrote about our experiences in our journals. They gave us time to think and talk about everything that we had seen and done that day. The journal sessions really helped us get everything out of our heads and onto paper. They were very important to our trip. Our final destination was Atlanta, Georgia. We visited the National Center for Civil and Human Rights, which connects to the American Civil Rights Movement with everything that we saw earlier and more. We went to the King Center. The King Center, which is named after Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and portrays his whole life, it is also where Dr. King and now his wife are buried. We celebrated his legacy. We visited the house where he lived and learned about his work and his life, Dr. Martin Luther King. It's only fitting that we ended the tour at his gravesite, since at the beginning of the tour, we stopped at the Lorraine Hotel where Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated. Those are some of my favorite highlights of our tour. I hope you have learned something. Every day, Mr. Love told us, and I tell you, history, you need to learn it. You need to respect it. And then, you wonderful, wonderful people, you go out and make history. So happy to share this book and Caleb's experience with you. And thank you so much. Maybe sometime in the future, I'll come to your schools and talk to you directly. I, your parents, and your family, and your community love you. Thank you so much.